Howdy do, everyone, and welcome to Pencils Down, a podcast about education, policy, policy, education, and everything in between. My name is Sam Zuckert, and this is Episode 4, Infrastructure Near and Far. Here at Pencils Down, our syllabus contains 3 sections: Study Hall, the Chicago Policy Review, and School Days. In Study Hall, we will talk with someone who has had interesting experience or insight into current education and policy issues. And our guest for Study Hall today is Professor Anjali Adukia, an assistant professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy and the college. Her work is focused on how to reduce inequalities such that children from historically disadvantaged backgrounds have equal opportunities to develop their full potential. She examines how the provision of basic needs such as safety, health, justice, and representation can increase school participation and improve child outcomes, and we are extremely excited to have her with us today. Professor Adukia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to be with you today.
It's great to have you here. So you've done research in the past on education outcomes in developing countries. How would you define a place that has a developing public education system?
I mean, what is a developing context? It's a place where there's high inequality, low resources, increased militarization of public spaces, and in that respect, what place doesn't have a developing public education system?
Mm-hmm.
There are issues all around the world, including the U.S.
Absolutely. And so what challenges might schools and school systems face under these conditions?
There are various challenges, but they vary by context and local policies. Funding models differ. When there's great inequality, wealthy parents will often opt for private schools, even if the private schools aren't necessarily better. Government teachers in many places are employed for life. But then because they're employed for life, there may not be incentives to actually show up. And there's a big problem around the world in terms of teacher absenteeism. But we have to remember that so in places like India, for example, they found that 25% of teachers may not show up. But, part of the focus needs to be on the 75% who do show up.
Absolutely. And so what are some challenges maybe for students in this context?
So in a lot of these places, the very, very fundamental needs that we think of sometimes in places like the U.S. aren't even being met. There isn't necessarily even a school building or, for example, many, many years ago, when the World Bank wanted to build a school, they literally just thought about classrooms. They weren't thinking, we need a sanitation facility or a kitchen for midday meals. And so if students themselves don't actually have a physical place to go to, that can present its own set of challenges. But, there are also other issues related to safety and health. And, when families want to think about sending their children to school, they are thinking about, am I sending my child to a safe place? Am I being responsible? So, a lot of times, so I do work, as you said, as you noted, in developing contexts. And, a lot of times when people say, you do work in developing contexts, why don't you just give laptops to every child? And and the fact is, sure, I think kids would love a laptop, but there are really basic, fundamental issues. And so, I'm very interested in understanding how much further do we get if we really think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the base of that pyramid, if we can provide very, very basic needs, such as safety, such as health, such as economic security, how much further will kids get? And that's something that I saw when I, visited various families in India. You would talk to a girl during the day. She was 12 years old. And she would talk about the wonders of education. And I'd say, well, it's during the school day. Why are you not in school? And she'd say, well, I had to miss a few days each month because of my period. And I missed during exams. They wouldn't let me retake them. So I failed out. And so, you would hear these stories over and over. Or during school visits, kids, a girl showing me where they used the bathroom. Because I'd say, where do you go? And then she pointed behind the bushes and said, Jyoti went behind the bushes, but the boys came and did bad things to her, so she can no longer come to school. Now, she is the one who had to drop out of school. The boys were still there. And, this girl saying, I'm so scared that it's going to happen to me that I don't eat or drink during the day. Sometimes I feel faint or dizzy, but it's better than the alternative. And when you talk to parents, there's this notion in a lot of these contexts that parents don't care about their daughters. If you just step back for a moment and really approach everybody with compassion and this belief that on average, people do what they believe is best for their children. when you talk to these parents, they say you actually see often they are actually paying for private school right up until puberty.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly they pull their daughters out. And you say, well, wait a second. You have invested all this money when you could have gone to the free option in the government school nearby. Why are you suddenly taking her out? And parents talking about, well, if I send my daughter to school and she's molested or somehow her honor is damaged in some way, then it will actually hurt her prospects for marriage. And I will then no longer be able to have her get married into a quote unquote good family, whatever that means. But if that is your objective function, if you know that that is, the future world, then you as a parent believe, or at least a lot of these parents I spoke with believe that the most irresponsible thing they could do is actually send their daughter into a place where they could get hurt. And so it was more responsible to keep them home. And so there are these various challenges related to safety or even health. And so, so one of I study sanitation, for example, and if you don't contain the waste, then suddenly there are, this sort of soil pollution, groundwater contamination, and many issues related to negative health shocks. And so now, your kid is going to school, constantly getting sick. Maybe you're having to take off precious time from work or having to take them to the doctor, which is also expensive, or maybe not even in your village. And so instead of sending your child to a hotbed of contagion, it's actually potentially better for everyone involved just to keep them at home.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's interesting you talk about the Maslow's hierarchy of need, because I think even more in America, from my sense, people are concentrating on or focusing on this idea of educating the whole child and knowing that if their sense of security or their physical and mental health aren't being met, then they won't really be able, school won't be able to provide them with the knowledge they need if those basic functions aren't being met. So what in these contexts, how does public education compare to the private education? I know you mentioned that oftentimes families will elect to send their kids to a private school as opposed to the government or the public school. So how do these schools differ?
Yeah, so, it can actually go either way. And, while there is this perception that private is better, it's not clear what that perception is based on or if it's actually in reality necessarily better. So certainly in places like India, for example, so government teachers are employed for life. And it's very, very hard to get rid of them. But to get that government job, you often have to be, very high achieving or score very well or have high credentials. And they're often paid more in the government schools. Private schools may have more incentives to actually show up for work. So, there might be less teacher absenteeism in private schools, but again, they may not have the highest credentials ex ante. Though, it's an empirical question as to what makes an effective teacher. Mm-hmm. And so, it's not clear that one is necessarily better than the other. And so, often, there is a, overall anyway, I think especially when we think about government schools, I think that we actually know some of the things that we need to do to actually keep teachers coming to school and to, improve the working conditions. But some of it actually is about political will, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you mentioned earlier that you did a study on these, sanitation. In 2017, you published a study on the impact of latrine construction initiatives on educational outputs in schools. What were the results of this study?
Yeah. So, so if you go back to 2002, for example, over half of Indian schools had no sanitation facility. So whether you looked across public, private, wealthy, poor, rural, urban, and this goes back to kids literally were just going out behind the bushes or going out in the open. And, so in 1999, the government of India said, we really want to decrease open defecation. And they said, the schools are one place where, if they actually construct latrines, then we can actually shape the next generation. And so then they really encouraged schools, hey, you should construct latrines. But the fact is they weren't given any money. And this was, and so then they realized, so many years passed. And so then in 2003, they said, oh, clearly we just need to build it ourselves. And this was done through the Ministry of Drinking Water and Sanitation. And so, during the school break, the public health engineering departments went out and literally just constructed, over 70,000 latrines, across 269 districts. And, this was part of a larger initiative called the School Sanitation and Hygiene Education Program. And, to be clear, the hygiene education part was just, let's put up some posters. A lot of times those posters went away. The water part was sometimes let's give them a bucket. The buckets often went away. So really the big part was this latrine construction piece. And so, to be clear, and this is something that's the case all around the world when we think about different policies, there wasn't this policy coherence. As I mentioned, the World Bank, used to, when they thought about building a school, they thought about the classroom and thought, okay, somebody else is going to take care about the sanitation piece. Well, this was the case with the government as well. And so, education officials were not part of the decision as to who got a latrine and who didn't. And so that, they built all these latrines. And what we see is actually that, and part of the idea, or at least within the NGO sphere, the public discourse is around, we need to build latrines, especially for pubescent age girls, because it's going to help keep them in schools. But what we actually see is that school latrine construction benefited everybody. Girls, boys, older, younger. And, this is really important because we do have to, think about, well, if we want to improve gender equality and, outcomes, for girls, well, boys are part of that as well. And, so we see that school latrine construction benefits everybody. It actually benefits younger children, so prepubescent age children, potentially even more than pubescent age children. But the question is why, right? What are the potential mechanisms? And so, what does a latrine do? On one hand, it could be that it creates a private place, which makes, kids feel or girls feel, more comfortable. Maybe parents feel that, okay, this is a safe place to send my daughter. So they're more likely to send their kids. Boys also can benefit. In fact, we don't talk enough about boys. And in the child psychology literature, often you'll see that, young boys are more likely to be the targets of bullying than even girls. There's the potential negative health impact. So it could be that, or, now that we're containing waste, actually, we do see improvements in health. And so parents are more likely to send their kids. And then separately, that, it's not just kids who actually benefit from latrines. Teachers also benefit from latrines. And so in a survey that was done as to why teachers don't show up to school, they often reported, well, it's because of the absence of sanitation facilities. And so, maybe with that there's a different mechanism of, now teachers are actually showing up. And so what we see is, and so there's two mechanisms we're primarily thinking of, right? There's this privacy mechanism, and then there's the health mechanism. If privacy is a central concern, then what we would expect to see is that there would be only benefits if you built like sex-specific or gender-specific latrines. So separate latrines for girls and separate latrines for boys. So I should step back and say there were different kinds of latrines that were built. In some cases, there were these separate latrines. So it was, girl-specific or boy-specific. In other places, they actually built unisex latrines, where literally it would be often a room full of just pits where, boys and girls would be next to each other. And so there, it's clearly not private, but, so if privacy is a central concern, then you shouldn't see benefits from when they built unisex latrines, but when they built sex-specific latrines. But if health is really the driving factor, then it shouldn't matter what kind of latrine you built. You should actually see benefits from both. So what we actually see is that when you build girls-specific latrines, pubescent age girls benefit substantially, but they don't benefit when you build unisex latrines. But pubescent age boys actually benefit regardless of the type of latrine, and so do primary school kids. So younger children who are prepubescent age benefit regardless of the type of latrine, with relatively smaller additional gains from sex-specific latrines. But, that really highlights the importance of thinking about, what might be driving people's motivations when we think about expending very scarce resources. We also see that female teachers are more likely to work at schools that build gender-specific latrines as well, which